The aircraft carrier floated in the Persian Gulf like a small city on the sea, and somewhere beneath its steel decks, a young sailor named Keith Barry was learning that the Navy would either make him or break him. It was 1994, and the 18-year-old had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to become a Navy SEAL. Growing up in a working-class family, Keith had always been the kind of kid who pushed himself harder than anyone else. Pushed him. While other boys his age were satisfied with being good enough, Keith needed to be the best. There was something inside him that refused to accept mediocrity, a fire that would later serve him well in the most dangerous places on Earth. When he told his parents he was joining the Navy, they weren't surprised. Their son had always been drawn to challenge, to the things that other people considered too difficult. The path to becoming a SEAL was never meant to be easy. Basic underwater demolition. SEAL training, BUD/S, was designed to break men, to find the ones who would quit when things got impossibly hard and separate them from the ones who would keep going no matter what. Keith arrived in Coronado, California, ready to prove which category he belonged in. The instructors seemed like creatures from another world, men with voices like gravel and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. They screamed constantly, not out of anger but as a tool, a way of testing whether these candidates could perform under pressure. The cold water of the Pacific felt like knives against the skin. The sand got everywhere, in their boots, their bedding, their food. And the log PT sessions left muscles trembling and hands blistered. Every day was designed to push them to the edge and then ask for just a little more. Keith discovered something about himself during those months of hell. He discovered that his mind could control his body in ways he'd never imagined. When every muscle screamed for rest, when hypothermia threatened to shut down his systems, when quitting would have been so easy, he found a voice inside that simply refused to stop. One evolution at a time, one day at a time, he moved forward. Hell Week was the crucible. 5.5 days of continuous operation with a maximum of 4 hours of sleep total. Candidates ran and swam and paddled and carried boats through the freezing surf, while instructors did everything possible to make them quit. Men dropped out constantly, so ringing the bell 3 times to signal they were done. By the end, Keith stood among the handful who remained. He had earned the right to call himself a Navy SEAL. The years that followed took him to places that would never appear on tourist maps. Kosovo during the turmoil there, South America for operations that didn't make the news, and multiple deployments to Iraq during the worst of the fighting. In Fallujah, he conducted over 150 combat missions, moving through streets where every window could hide a sniper, every pile of trash could conceal an improvised explosive device. He was awarded the Navy Commendation Medal with Valor, among other commendations, for actions that his fellow SEALs would only describe in quiet voices. The human body was never designed to withstand what Keith's body endured. Multiple IED explosions, fragmentary grenades, the constant concussive blasts of combat. They took their toll in ways that weren't always visible on the surface. He was diagnosed with traumatic brain injury, the signature wound of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The doctors explained it to him in clinical terms, but what it really meant was that sometimes his thoughts felt like they were moving through molasses, that memories didn't always come when called, that the sharp edges of his mind had been worn down by years of explosions. By 2012, Keith had been in the Navy for 18 years. He was a senior chief, an E8, a leader of men who had proven himself in combat and in peacetime alike. His reputation among the SEAL community was solid, a quiet professional who did his job and looked out for his people. He'd been married and divorced, like so many in the special operations community, and he was navigating the complicated waters of post-combat life while still serving actively. That year, he met a woman through mutual friends. She was attractive, intelligent, and seemed to understand the demands of military life. What started as casual dating soon became something more intense, a relationship that burned hot and bright. Keith was clear with her from the beginning about what he wanted. He wasn't looking for marriage, wasn't ready for that kind of commitment after his divorce. She seemed to accept this, and for a while, things worked. But relationships in the military world are complicated. Deployments interrupt, stress accumulates, and people sometimes want different things. By early 2013, Keith realized that the relationship wasn't working for him anymore. And the connection they'd shared was fading, and he knew it was time to be honest about that. He sat her down and explained that he wanted to end things. It was uncomfortable, the way all breakups are uncomfortable, but he believed in being direct rather than dragging something out that was already over. What Keith didn't know, couldn't possibly have predicted, was that this simple act of ending a relationship would trigger a chain of events that would nearly destroy him. The woman didn't take the news well. She was hurt, angry, and looking for someone to blame for her pain. In the days after their final encounter, she talked with friends about what had happened between them. She described their sexual relationship in detail, characterizing it in ways that Keith would later say bore no resemblance to what had actually occurred. A couple of days after the breakup, she went to Keith's command. The accusation she made was devastating. She claimed that their last sexual encounter had been non-consensual, that Keith had assaulted her. She also took to Facebook, posting publicly that he had sexually assaulted her. Then she sought a gynecological exam and the help of a therapist to support her claims. Keith learned what was happening when NCIS agents showed up at his command. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service didn't mess around with sexual assault allegations. They couldn't, not with the intense scrutiny the military was under regarding how it handled such cases. Keith was informed that he was being investigated for rape, that his accuser had made serious allegations, and that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And he maintained his innocence from the very first moment. He explained that their relationship had been consensual, that their sexual encounters had been mutually agreeable, that this was a woman who was angry about being dumped and was using the only weapon she had left. But in the climate of 2013, with the military under tremendous political pressure to prove it was taking sexual assault seriously, his protestations fell on deaf ears. The investigation moved forward. Keith was pulled from his duties, his security clearance suspended, his reputation within the community suddenly tainted. He hadn't been convicted of anything, hadn't even been charged yet, but in the court of military opinion, the accusation itself was enough. Fellow SEALs looked at him differently. Supervisors treated him with careful distance, and the brotherhood that had sustained him through 18 years of service suddenly felt like it had developed cracks. Keith tried to focus on the legal process, on the belief that the truth would eventually come out. He had spent his entire adult life in a system that prized honor and integrity, that claimed to value justice above all else. Surely, he thought, when all the facts came out, when the investigators looked at the evidence, they would see that this was a false accusation born of hurt feelings and revenge. He was about to learn a hard lesson about how justice really works. The courtroom at Naval Base San Diego was nothing like the military courtrooms Keith had seen in movies. It was a plain, functional space with fluorescent lighting and government-issue furniture, as a place where lives were decided without any of the drama Hollywood might add. Keith sat at the defense table in his dress uniform, the ribbons on his chest representing 18 years of service and multiple combat deployments, and tried to maintain the composure that had carried him through Hell Week and Fallujah alike. The year was 2014, and the charges against him were 2 counts of rape. The military judge would decide his fate. He had waived his right to a jury trial, believing that a single judge would be more likely to evaluate the evidence rationally than a panel of officers who might be influenced by the political climate. It was a decision he would later question, but at the time it had seemed like the right call. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the testimony of his accuser, and there was no physical evidence of non-consent. There were no witnesses to contradict Keith's account of what had happened. The woman had gone to a therapist and a gynecologist after the fact, but those visits didn't prove that a crime had occurred. They only proved that she had sought medical attention. The texts and messages between them showed a consensual sexual relationship, including messages sent after the alleged assault that were friendly and affectionate. Keith's accuser took the stand and described their relationship. She acknowledged that they had engaged in consensual BDSM activities, the tying up, the blindfolds, the spanking with a bungee cord, the hot wax. These were things she had willingly participated in, things that were part of their sexual dynamic. But she claimed that on the final occasion, and she had not consented to penetration, that Keith had crossed a line without her permission. Under cross-examination, inconsistencies emerged. She had described one of their earlier encounters to an NCIS investigator as magical and just awesome. She had continued communicating with Keith after the alleged assault. She had talked with friends about how to handle the breakup before making any accusation. Her story shifted in small ways that might have mattered in a different climate, in a different time. Keith's defense team advised him not to testify. The military justice system, they explained, was unpredictable, and putting him on the stand could backfire. The prosecution would tear into him, would try to portray a combat-hardened SEAL as a predator, and there was no guarantee that the judge would believe his version of events over the accusers. Keith trusted his lawyers. He stayed silent and let the evidence speak for itself. On February 27, 2015, the military judge delivered his verdict. Keith Barry was found guilty of one count of sexual assault. The sentence was 3 years of confinement, reduction in rank from Senior Chief E8 to the lowest enlisted rank of E1, dishonorable discharge from the Navy, and registration as a sex offender for the rest of his life. The room seemed to tilt beneath Keith's feet. 18 years of service, 150 combat missions, the Navy Commendation Medal with Valor, the traumatic brain injury from protecting his country, all of it erased in a single moment by a judge who had never been to Fallujah, who had never led men in combat, who had never done anything except sit in this fluorescent-lit room and decide that a woman's word was worth more than a SEAL's entire life. But the case wasn't over. Under military law, the verdict had to be reviewed by the convening authority, the admiral who had referred the case for trial. That admiral was Rear Admiral Patrick Lorge, commander of Navy Region Southwest in San Diego. And Admiral Lorge had the power to do something extraordinary. He could overturn the judge's verdict entirely if he believed the evidence didn't support a conviction. Keith's attorney, David Sheldon, filed a clemency request laying out all the problems with the case, the lack of evidence, the inconsistencies in the accuser's testimony, the political climate that had pressured the prosecution forward. They waited, hoping that one man with the courage to do the right thing might still save Keith's life. Admiral Lorge reviewed the case thoroughly. He read the transcripts, examined the evidence, considered the arguments. And as he did so, he reached a conclusion that surprised even himself. He didn't believe Keith Barry was guilty. In his judgment, the government had not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence simply didn't support the conviction. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of it. Lorge would have disapproved the findings, overturned the conviction, and Keith would have been cleared. But these were not normal circumstances. These were the years when the military was under unprecedented pressure from Washington to prove it was serious about sexual assault. Lorge's staff attorneys, Commander Dominic Jones and Lieutenant Commander John Dowling made their positions clear. Disapproving the findings in a sexual assault case would create a perception that the Navy was soft on these crimes. It would attract negative attention from Congress, from the media, from the White House. It would be a career-ending move for any admiral who made it. Then the phone calls started. Vice Admiral Nanette DeRenzi, the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, expressed concerns about the Navy's reputation. She reminded Lorge that military commanders were regularly questioned by Congress about how they handled sexual assault cases, that the political climate made it dangerous to be seen as lenient. She didn't explicitly tell him what to do, but her message was clear enough. Overturning this conviction would cause problems. And then came the call from Vice Admiral James Crawford III, DeRenzi's deputy and soon-to-be successor. Crawford was more direct. According to Lorge's later recollection, Crawford told him that if he disapproved the findings in Barry's case, it would ruin his career. Not might ruin his career. Would ruin his career. Lorge was approaching retirement. He had served his country for decades, had earned the right to leave with his reputation and his pension intact. Facing pressure from the top legal officers in the Navy, from the political climate in Washington, from his own staff who warned of the consequences, he made a decision that would haunt him for years. He approved the conviction. Keith Barry was transported to the Naval Consolidated Brig in Miramar, California, to begin serving his 3-year sentence. And he was processed like any other prisoner. Strip searches, prison uniforms, a small cell with a metal bunk. The man who had conducted over 150 combat missions, who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had led SEALs in the most dangerous places on Earth, was now inmate number something or other in a military prison. The dishonorable discharge meant that everything he had earned was gone. His retirement, his benefits, his reputation, all stripped away. He would be registered as a sex offender for the rest of his life, a label that would follow him everywhere, that would define him in the eyes of anyone who ran a background check. For a crime he did not commit. The guards at Miramar knew who he was. A SEAL in a military prison is a target. Either other inmates want to prove themselves by taking on the baddest guy in the facility, or the guards themselves treat him differently because of who he used to be. Keith kept to himself, stayed quiet, minded his own business. He knew that if he got into a fight, if he hurt someone, the system would have a legitimate reason to keep him locked up longer. So he swallowed his pride and his anger and survived one day at a time. The worst moment came when he was denied his prescription medication. He had been taking medication for his traumatic brain injury, medication that helped manage the symptoms of years of explosions. The prison authorities told him they would not provide it unless he signed a confession admitting guilt for the crime he didn't commit. Keith refused. He would not admit to something he hadn't done, even if it meant suffering the consequences of his untreated brain injury. The days became harder, while the fog in his head grew thicker. The sharp edges of his mind, already worn down by combat, became duller still. There were nights in that cell when he thought about ending it all. The bunk, the walls, the certainty of years more of this existence. It pressed down on him like the weight of the ocean during BUD/S training. He thought about how easy it would be to just stop fighting, to let the darkness take him. But then he thought about what would happen if he did. They would say he killed himself out of guilt. They would say the conviction was justified, that he couldn't live with what he'd done. The truth would die with him, and his name would forever be associated with a crime he never committed. That thought was worse than any physical suffering the prison could inflict. Keith Barry decided to live. He decided to fight. And in his cell, he discovered the writings of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. He read about accepting what cannot be changed, about finding strength within oneself, about viewing obstacles not as barriers, but as opportunities for growth. "The obstacle is the way," Marcus Aurelius wrote. Keith internalized those words, made them his mantra. The prison walls became his classroom. The suffering became his teacher. 2.5 years passed. 2.5 years of confinement, of separation from everything he knew and loved, of fighting to maintain his sanity and his hope. And all the while, outside those walls, a legal battle was brewing that would eventually expose the truth about what had really happened to Keith Barry.